Putin just lost something he has been building for 25 years, and he lost it in 72 hours. In 3 consecutive nights, Ukrainian drones flew nearly 800 kilometers into the heart of Russia, past what the Kremlin calls the strongest air defense network on the planet, and torched the 3 crown jewels of Russia's oil export empire: Primorsk, Ust-Luga, Kirishi, one of the biggest Baltic crude terminals on Earth, the second largest refinery in the Russian Federation, and an oil export hub that moves more than 1 million barrels every single day. All of them hit in the same week. Reuters has now confirmed that 40% of Russia's entire seaborne crude export capacity was taken offline. Bloomberg puts the loss for a single 7-day stretch at roughly $1 billion. Al Jazeera, citing Reuters, has called it the most severe oil supply disruption in the modern history of Russia, the world's second-largest oil exporter. That is not a raid. That is a strangulation. And instead of admitting it, the Kremlin turned around and accused 4 NATO members of opening their airspace, threatening them under Article 51 of the UN Charter within days. That story has already fallen apart on international media. But the damage to Putin's wallet is very, very real. In the next few minutes, we're going to show you exactly how Ukraine did it, what it actually cost Moscow, why the Russian excuse is already collapsing on its own state television, and why this might be the moment Putin's war economy starts bleeding out for good. Now let's back up for a second and get the sequence straight, because the timing is what makes this so devastating. It started on the night of March 23rd. Leningrad Region Governor Alexander Drozdenko posted to Telegram that air defenses had been engaged and that a fuel tank had caught fire at the port of Primorsk. That is the Transneft Port Primorsk terminal, sitting between the Finnish border and St. Petersburg, and it moves more than 1 million barrels of crude per day at full capacity. Drozdenko initially claimed only a pipeline had been damaged, then later revised his story, admitting that a fuel reservoir had been hit by shrapnel and had started leaking. He insisted the damage was minor, that 70 drones had been shot down in a single night, and that operations were normal. But Reuters cited industry sources the very same day saying Primorsk had suspended oil loadings entirely, and so had Ust-Luga, another major Baltic export hub, located just 80 kilometers to the south. 2 of Russia's most critical oil outlets offline in a single morning. Ukraine's general staff later confirmed that its drones had struck an oil tank farm and the oil loading pier at the Primorsk terminal, with satellite footage reviewed by Al Jazeera, suggesting that at least 5 of the terminal's 18 storage tanks had been damaged. Not a leak, not minor, direct hits on the loading infrastructure itself. And this is where things get even more serious. 2 nights later, on March 25th, Ukrainian drones came back for Ust-Luga. This time they came in what the Moscow Times described as the largest overnight drone wave of the year, with the Russian Defense Ministry itself admitting 389 drones were downed across multiple regions. Ust-Luga exports around 700,000 barrels of oil products per day and handles about 8% of the entire world's naphtha supply. It is the second largest port in the Russian Federation after Novorossiysk and the largest actively under expansion. It exported 32.9 million metric tons of oil products last year alone, according to Reuters. Satellite imagery, later reviewed by Reuters and the American geospatial firm Vantor, confirmed that 8 massive storage reservoirs at the Ust-Luga terminal, each with a capacity of 30,000 cubic meters, had been burned out. That is roughly a quarter of the terminal's total storage gone. Berth infrastructure was hit as well. And Ukraine was just getting started. On the following night, March 26th, Ust-Luga was hit again. Locals posted video of the port burning for the second consecutive night. Pulkovo International Airport in St. Petersburg was forced to suspend arrivals and departures both nights running because the drone swarms overhead were too dense to safely route civilian aircraft. Think about that for a moment. One of Russia's biggest international airports shut down by Ukrainian drone traffic over 2 consecutive nights, 1,500 kilometers from the front line. And then came the night of March 26th itself. More than 20 Ukrainian drones struck the Kirishi refinery, known by its Russian acronym KNF. This is not a small facility. According to Reuters and the Kyiv Post, Kirishi is one of the 3 largest refineries in the entire Russian Federation, processing roughly 17.5 million metric tons of crude per year, or about 355,000 barrels per day. That is 6.6% of Russia's total refining capacity produced in a single plant. In 2024 alone, Kirishi pushed out 2 million tons of gasoline, 7.1 million tons of diesel, 6.1 million tons of fuel oil, and 600,000 tons of bitumen. A lot of that diesel goes straight to the Russian military. Ukraine's general staff said so in its post-strike statement, calling Kirishi part of the Russian war machine's fuel supply. The general staff later confirmed on Telegram that the strike damaged the primary ELOU-AVT-2 and ELOU-AVT-6 distillation units, the hydro-treating trains, the bitumen lines, and the gas fractionation system. 2 industry sources told Reuters that the refinery halted processing entirely, and Kirishi is sitting more than 790 kilometers from the nearest point on the Ukrainian border. This was actually the 5th known Ukrainian strike on this specific refinery since March 2024. The previous hit in October 2025 forced the shutdown of its most powerful processing unit. So this is not some lucky one-off. This is a refinery that Ukraine has been mapping, targeting, and retargeting for 2 full years. Think about what that number 790 kilometers actually means for a second. We will come back to it. Now this is where the story takes another turn, because Moscow's reaction to losing 3 strategic nodes in 3 nights was not to fix the problem. It was to invent a new one. Within hours of the Primorsk hit, Russian state television pushed a single explanation across every channel. It wasn't the drones. It wasn't the Ukrainians. It was, they claimed, NATO airspace. Specifically Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu publicly warned the 4 Baltic-adjacent NATO states and Finland that Russia could invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right of self-defense, if those countries kept, as he put it, deliberately providing their airspace to Ukrainian attacks. Kremlin aide Nikolai Patrushev echoed him, saying the Baltic states were complicit in what he called crimes. And Russia's foreign ministry, through spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, formally warned Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn that if they did not listen, they would have to deal with the consequences. It was a threat, a real one. And it was also, according to every independent source, a lie. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania released a joint statement flatly denying that they had ever allowed their territory to be used for strikes on Russia. The European digital media watchdog, EDMO, published a full forensic breakdown on how the claim originated, tracing it back to a single Russian Telegram channel, MASH, which published a map of an alleged drone route through the Baltics. Within 1 hour, the state program 60 Minutes on Rossiya 1 had recycled the same map as official news. It was a coordinated disinformation push launched to cover for a much more uncomfortable truth. The uncomfortable truth is this: Ukrainian drones really did fly 790 kilometers into the Leningrad region. They really did do it through Russian airspace. And they really did burn down a refinery the size of Kirishi, while Russian air defenses watched. The Kremlin cannot admit that. Because if that is admitted, the question that follows is the one Putin does not want anyone asking out loud. If Kirishi can burn, what can't? But that's just the beginning. Because to understand just how badly this week went for Moscow, you have to look at three separate things at once. How they hit it, what it actually cost, and why it can't be fixed on any useful timeline. We're going to walk through all three. The first angle is the weapon itself. Ukraine over the past 18 months has turned long-range unmanned strike into an industrial process. This is not a lab project. Ukraine's security service and its unmanned systems forces, led by Robert Brovdi, confirmed publicly that the Ust-Luga strike was carried out by the Alpha Special Operations Center using long-range drones that covered more than 900 kilometers. The drones in question are Ukraine's homegrown deep strike designs, including the AN-196 Lyuty class, a low-cost, propeller-driven, low-radar signature platform that Russia itself has previously identified in crashed drone debris, including pieces recovered by Finnish border guards in recent weeks. These platforms are not precision-guided munitions by NATO standards. They are cheap, they are built in serial production, and they are being manufactured by the thousand. President Volodymyr Zelensky said earlier in April that Ukraine is now capable of producing at least 2,000 combat-proven interceptor drones every single day and is offering half of them to Gulf states. On the strike side, an open-source analyst quoted by Al Jazeera confirmed that Ukrainian deep strike missions 50 to 250 kilometers inside Russia have quadrupled over the past year to around 45 a month. Compare that to what Russia has. Russia, despite Iranian help, was only producing 90 Shahed drones a day in mid-2025. By January 2026, that had climbed to around 400 a day, according to Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky. Russia is building them faster, Ukraine is building them smarter, and Ukraine is targeting them better. That is not asymmetric anymore. That is industrial scale. And it is happening against an air defense system the Russian government has spent the entire 21st century advertising as world-class, with S-300, S-400 Pantsir and Tor layers all stacked on top of each other. All of those systems were active during the last week of March. All of them failed to stop the strikes that mattered. The second angle is the financial blood loss, and this is where Putin should be panicking. According to Bloomberg calculations cited by the Moscow Times, Russian total seaborne crude exports fell 43% in the week of March 22nd to 29th. They dropped from 4.072 million barrels per day the week before the strikes to just 2.318 million barrels per day during the week of the strikes. Primorsk alone went from 10 loaded tankers in the previous week to just 4. Ust-Luga shipments dropped from a normal week to 2 tankers. The estimated revenue loss just for that 1 week was $1 billion. $1 billion. And because Ust-Luga handles roughly 8% of global naphtha, that single port dragged world naphtha shipments down by around 70%. Reuters calculated that overall strikes like these have cut Russia's total refining capacity by 17%, or about 1.1 million barrels per day. Al Jazeera called it the most severe oil supply disruption in the modern history of Russia, the world's second-largest oil exporter. That is not rhetoric. That is Reuters, Bloomberg, and Al Jazeera using the same language at the same time. And this is where things get really interesting. But before we get to the third angle, this is a quick reminder that you're watching Military Outlook. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. So hit subscribe to ensure you stay ahead of the curve. Now let's move on to the third angle, because this is the one the Kremlin really cannot fix: the repair timeline. An oil export terminal like Primorsk is not a warehouse. It is a network of massive reservoirs, pipelines, mooring points, and specialized loading equipment built over decades. Primorsk itself has been operational since 2001, a quarter-century-long investment that underpins Russia's entire Baltic oil strategy. Satellite imagery supplied by the U.S. geospatial firm Vantor and reviewed by Reuters showed that at least 40% of the oil storage at Primorsk had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. At Ust-Luga, 8 reservoirs of 30,000 cubic meters each were burned through, along with berth infrastructure. At Kirishi, according to one of the Reuters industry sources, it was hard to even estimate how long repairs would take, because the damaged units were primary distillation columns. Those are not spare parts you keep in a warehouse. They are complex, custom-fabricated pieces of machinery, many of them originally sourced from Western suppliers who are now blocked by sanctions. The ELOU-AVT series in particular uses catalysts, heat exchangers, and control systems that were historically imported from Germany, Italy, France, and the United States. Post-2022 sanctions packages have systematically cut off those supply chains. Russia is going to have to rebuild them domestically or cannibalize other refineries or wait. And during that wait, every barrel that would have flowed through those facilities is a barrel Moscow cannot sell, cannot ship, and cannot tax. The Kremlin's entire war budget runs on hydrocarbon revenue. This is a direct cut into the artery that funds the front. Remember, we are talking about roughly 1.7 million barrels per day of combined Primorsk and Ust-Luga export capacity, plus 355,000 barrels a day of Kirishi refining throughput, all disrupted simultaneously. Even if each facility is only partially down for 2 or 3 months, that is a multi-billion-dollar hit to the Russian federal budget, layered on top of an economy that is already burning through its sovereign wealth fund to pay for the war. And that brings us to the fourth angle: the strategic sequencing. Look at the map. Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Kirishi are not random. They are the 3 biggest export and processing nodes in Russia's entire northwestern corridor. They sit close together geographically, meaning the same drone swarm tactics work for all 3. Hitting them in the same week forces Russia to concentrate repair crews, mobile air defense, and firefighting equipment in a single region, while every other Russian oil facility, from Novorossiysk on the Black Sea to Bashkortostan in the Urals, stays vulnerable. And indeed, in the same week, Ukraine also struck the Saratov refinery, the Bashneft Ufaneftekhim refinery in Bashkortostan, the Norsy refinery in Nizhny Novgorod, and later the Sheskaris oil terminal at Novorossiysk. This is not a series of one-off raids. This is, and you can quote this, a campaign of oil sector strangulation. Signs are pointing towards something even bigger. If current trends continue, Ukraine will not need to defeat Russia on the front line. It will bankrupt it from above. And this is where Putin's nightmare truly begins. Because the strategic math here is ugly, and it is getting uglier. Russia's war economy depends on roughly 4 million barrels per day of export revenue to keep pensions paid, defense contracts funded, and the ruble from collapsing. Ukraine just cut that figure nearly in half for a full week, using aircraft that cost a tiny fraction of what a single repaired storage tank will cost Russia to rebuild. A deep strike drone like the AN-196 is estimated to cost in the low 6 figures of US dollars at most. A single 30,000 cubic meter storage reservoir at Ust-Luga, plus the pipeline's control systems and loading infrastructure around it, runs into the tens of millions. The exchange rate, in other words, is absolutely brutal for Moscow. Put simply, every dollar Ukraine spends hitting this network forces Russia to spend at least $100 trying to fix it. That is the real meaning of asymmetric warfare in 2026. And here's where things get really interesting. Moscow's response has been to deny that it happened, blame NATO neighbors, threaten Finland and the Baltics under Article 51, and quietly hope world oil markets smooth things over. They will not. Oil prices did react to the strikes. Brent crude rose toward the $108 per barrel range at the end of March, according to Al Jazeera's tracking, and that partly does help Russia on the margin. But the disruption at Primorsk and Ust-Luga means Russia cannot physically ship enough volume to actually benefit from the price. Higher prices on a barrel you cannot load onto a tanker are worth nothing. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the strikes terrorist attacks and promised that Russia was working on protecting its critical infrastructure. But Leningrad Oblast has reported that more than 240 drones had already been shot down in that region alone since the start of 2026. And that was before the worst week of the campaign. If 240 interceptions still left Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Kirishi all burning in a single week, then the defense is not working. The Russian air defense grid protecting the richest oil infrastructure in the country, the literal center of gravity for the regime's war finances, could not stop a force of subsonic propeller-driven drones from 800 kilometers away. What is happening in front of the world right now is a sitting oil exporter being told in real time that its single most important revenue stream is no longer safe. What we could see next is a Kremlin forced to choose between admitting the vulnerability and escalating against NATO neighbors who never did anything. And neither option ends well for Putin. If he admits the truth, he exposes Russia's air defense failure to every investor, every partner, every observer in China and the Gulf who is still pricing Russia as a stable energy supplier. If he escalates against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Finland, he invokes the very Article 5 response he has spent years trying to deter. The quiet part out loud is this. Moscow started a war of attrition, expecting to grind Ukraine into surrender. Instead, Ukraine has re-engineered the entire concept of attrition and pointed it straight at the one thing Putin actually cannot replace: his cash flow. And if this pattern continues for another 3 or 4 months, if Novorossiysk, Tuapse, and the Black Sea export cluster start seeing the same tempo of strikes that Primorsk and Ust-Luga just saw, then the Russian federal budget, already under serious strain, is going to start making choices Moscow has not had to make since the early 1990s. And that is the reality Moscow is waking up to tonight. If you want to stay on top of this, subscribe to Military Outlook and turn on notifications. We'll see you on the next one.